Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I am presenting to you today as part of the series on Islam and science on the topic of what does it mean to be human, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the soul. So this is part of the teaching workshop for faculty on this topic on seminars that have previously been taught on to students. So for those of you who are teaching these subjects, hopefully we can offer some hints and tips. The way this presentation, the short presentation will go is that we will first talk about the concept of human nature in the Islamic context. Next we'll talk about the neuroscience and its approach to human nature. Then we'll move on to a possible conflict between the two and how this can possibly be resolved, and some of the key concepts that we should be aware of in this very vast topic. So we'll start here with the Islamic key elements of Islamic belief. So in this area, the human self is composed of two elements according to Islamic theology, the body and the soul. And if we look at the Quranic terminology for the creation of the human being, it uses terms like khalq for the creation of the physical person, and amr, which can mean command or direction, to indicate the spiritual and the human potential of the human being. And there are various terms that are used for this that get to the root of the spirit of the human being, such as ruh, qalb, aql, and nafs, which is beyond the pale of our discussion here. But the concept is that humans are both spiritual and physical at the same time. And humans have agency and free will and thinking abilities. And whenever we give certain powers to the human, we must keep in mind the powers of God in Islamic theology, such as all power ultimately belongs to God, and God is the cause for everything, whereas He has offered human beings a limited domain of freedom. So with that background, we can begin to talk about what does it mean to be human, and this is a thought experiment that we can offer our students. We can ask, does it mean to be human, to be alive, to eat and drink, to engage in intellectual activities, to speak, to have feelings? But as we see from the Islamic context and the literature of the Tazkiyah and Tasawwuf and Tasira, we find that to be really human, the full potentiality of the human is realized in their relationship with God, in their building of good character, and in their love for Allah and His Messenger. So there is sort of a ladder in which human beings can climb, and this transformative process is a unique ability of the human being. But to be able to do this, the prerequisite is to have consciousness, which we will talk a lot about in this presentation. So the key element from an Islamic perspective to be human is to have this transformative self, which has the ability to go from arrogance to humility, self-admiration to gratitude, and so forth. This slide compliments of Sheikh Karamali. When we look at it from the scientific perspective, what does it mean to be human? Basically, we're looking at the human from an empirical perspective as a functional and behavioral unit. So what abilities do the humans have? We come up with intelligence, language, mathematics, memory, information processing, etc. And of course, we can't deny that humans also have this particular unique characteristic called consciousness. And we can localize a lot of the human functions to the brain, including consciousness. But the hard problem in science then becomes understanding how the brain can produce this thing called consciousness, and what is consciousness. So consciousness is basically subjectivity. It's our subjective experience of the world. It is what it is like to feel something, to hear something, to taste something. It's our thoughts, love, our feelings, our self-awareness of ourselves, our ability to think about other things that are not local, and understanding and knowledge, being able to hold things within ourselves. So these aspects are not purely physical things. These are mental things, and not only that, they seem to have a different category of existence that is subjective, different from some of the other elements of what makes humans, such as DNA and RNA and chemical makeup. In terms of consciousness and understanding where it fits in science and within the human body, we can look at the practical example of clinical medicine, where often in life and death situations we have to assess for consciousness. And the most common way to do this is by clinical exam. You ask the patient to open their eyes or to squeeze your finger to assess for whether there is somebody home, whether there's some patient has awareness of what we're talking to them about. And the two elements of consciousness in medicine are awakeness and awareness. Is the patient alert or oriented? And there are cases in which the patient is unable to express their awareness even though they are aware. So the well-known locked-in syndrome, in which the patient is fully aware but they have no physical manifestation. So we know this is the case because their brain is still functional, and they might be able to communicate with either sort of eye motions or more recently with these advanced imaging techniques such as functional MRI, in which we can ask the patient to do certain things, think of certain things, like imagine yourself playing tennis or walking through your house, and we can see the pattern of activation that occurs in the brain, and from this you can establish communication with the patient. So clearly the home of consciousness is in the brain and associated with these brain networks. What is the mechanism for the conscious experience to occur in the brain? There are two primary networks that this ongoing research tells us about, and the first one is this sort of reticular activating system, primarily associated with human wakefulness or awakeness, and this is mediated through the midbrain. So we see the patients who have neurodegenerative disorders will have atrophy of their midbrain, and they'll have disorders of consciousness and cognition. So basically what this does is that takes the inputs from the rest of the body and then transmits it to the cerebral cortex, arousing the system. And then in terms of awareness, much research is currently being done on the default mode network, is this pattern of activation, particularly in this sort of parasagittal parietal lobe, that we see when we have an awareness of something. When we become self-aware of seeing something, for example, this area is then activated. So, and it turns out that it's not a simple thing where you have a simple physical stimulus, and then you have a corresponding mental stimulus that explains this consciousness. These are a summary of some of the predominant theories, scientific theories about consciousness. And you can see that, for example, these have to do with vision. When you see something, it's projecting onto the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, and from there, it has to be projected into a complex network of neuronal activity within the brain, after which you become conscious of seeing whatever you're seeing. So this complexity of the neural networks is what's associated with consciousness. And that's from a scientific perspective. And over here, what you're looking at is a landscape of consciousness, all of the philosophical theories, including the scientific theories of consciousness, summarized in one chart by Dr. Kuhn. And you can see that there's no consensus on how consciousness works, but you can see that the vast majority of theories are materialistic theories. And this is going to become a problem, as we will see. And their attempts to solve this hard problem of how the material brain creates this sort of non-material experience of consciousness follows in this principle in science called Occam razor, which means that the simplest solution is the more likely to be the correct solution. So if we can explain something simply by physics or chemistry, then we don't need to appeal to anything beyond that. So we can see that such as the subjective experience of consciousness, and one of the most popular theories, and we can see that there's this strong bias within neuroscience research. For example, one of the popular theories about consciousness, called the integrated information theory, found a strong backlash amongst neuroscientists because it assumed that consciousness is real. And the predominant view among neuroscientists is that consciousness has to be explained away. And we can see this in all of the current literature coming out of neuroscience and philosophy. And this view is called neuroscientific reductionism, the idea that I am just my brain. This is summarized well by the famous DNA scientist Francis Crick, who writes, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." So why is this a problem from a Islamic perspective? So what they're basically saying, this particular group of neuroscientists, is that the consciousness is simply an artifact of the brain, and what this implies is neuroscientific reductionism. And what that implies is that humans are nothing but the physical processes of the brain. That means that there is nothing more to the human than the brain itself. Just like, for example, you can see this triangle here for illustrative purposes. What it is to be a triangle is to be a three-sided figure. And that's all you need to be a triangle. There's nothing else that needs to be added. Similarly, the human is just the brain. If physicalism is true, then there is no room for any of the spiritual elements of humanity. There's no real self, and what we see of the self is just an illusion. And the terminology that's used for the self or the consciousness in this framework are simply epistemic placeholders. Things like computation, modeling, representation. These are not, they don't have an independent existence. These are just sort of words used as placeholders to explain something without them being independently real. So what we're seeing here is the conflict between objective science and subjective experience. Science uses objective methods. It needs to be able to reproduce things and quantify them, whereas what the consciousness is a subjective experience. Modern science has no way of dealing with that, so it has to explain it away. And where does this idea come from? And we can see that there was a deliberate attempt. If we look at the history of European development of modern science and look at the works of Galileo and Descartes, there is a specific, deliberate attempt to describe the natural world in mathematical terms and to exclude any of the sensory qualities, what they would call qualia, from physics, from the physical world. And their idea was to move it to the mind or the soul, move these qualities to the mind and out of the physical world. But the problem we now have is that we're trying to explain the mind by physical methods. So now this is a illustrative thought experiment that you can do with your students, is to show them this red apple and to ask, what are the characteristics of this apple? Obviously it has, size, shape, weight, and so forth, but what else? Does it have color and taste? Does it have smell? And according to this modern scientific view, it has none of those secondary qualities of color and taste, for example. Those are simply in the mind. All that the apple really has is a weight, a shape, and those types of measurable qualities. So what we're dealing with then is a problem of ontology. What ontology is the word that is just used to describe the nature of something. And in the ontology of modern science, there is no space for subjective experience, like we said, or something that is, or qualitative properties of nature. And this is something that's very different from the traditional ontologies of nature that existed in the pre-modern world. For example, in the Aristotle's view, there was substance and then there was form. In the Kalam Islamic tradition, there were substrates and accidents. The accidents were not intrinsic to the body, but held and given to the substrate by God in every given time. But still, there were secondary properties that existed. And then one of the unique attributes that the humans had were the soul, which they would call a subtle substance or a non-physical accident. But what we have now is a form of scientific reductionism coming out of modern science. However, there are significant problems with this type of a view, even within the secular framework that they themselves recognize. Or there are a large group of scientists and philosophers who are beginning to recognize this problem. And we can see this by a number of thought experiments that have been proposed. And the most famous of this, of course, is Descartes' thought experiment, where he says, "I think, therefore I am." And what he is basically affirming is that his own existence of his own subjective self is something that is very real and cannot be denied. In fact, that's the only thing he thinks cannot be denied. And Ibn Sina has a similar floating man experiment in which he illustrates that our own sense of the self is independent of any physical experiences. And the famous American philosopher, and these are thought experiments that you can read about beyond the time that we have for this presentation, but the American philosopher Nagel, he illustrates that subjective experience is what it is like to be something, and this is something that all of the methods of modern science cannot come to terms with. Mary's room is a thought experiment which illustrates that having the experience of something is more above and beyond simply knowing about something. And Ibn Tufayl has a similar thought experiment. David Chalmers has a thought experiment called the philosophical zombie. In other words, if you had two human beings, one was had no subjective experience, whereas the other one has a subjective experience, would we consider the one without a subjective experience to be a human? Questionable. And the one with the subjective experience, what this thought experiment implies is that the subjective experience is something over and above, something added on to the physical existence of the human. And finally, the Chinese room experiment, which illustrates that knowledge and understanding are something that cannot be attributed to an algorithmic understanding of the brain. So a lot of the mechanisms that we are currently used to explain consciousness are based on computers and artificial intelligence, and this thought experiment illustrates well how the human, how the attributes of the human understanding and knowledge are not the same. So what's happening is that even amongst the scientists, there's a growing number of scientists who are realizing that they will not be able to reduce consciousness to a material substance or a physical process, and that consciousness has to be accepted, subjective experience has to be accepted as having an independent existence. And many of these will fall into what's called panpsychism. And of course, like from an Islamic perspective, we don't have to agree with any of these theories, except that the progress that's being made here is that we are now beginning to understand that, at least among some scientists, that the world consists of more than just objective material and physical substances, but also of non-physical subjective properties. So there is promise, and if we understand science in this comprehensive and holistic way, moving away from physicalism, where there's space for non-physical entities and properties, and in this way, then it is not logically impossible to talk about the Islamic concept of the human being as having physical and spiritual characteristics above and beyond the physical processes. So as a Muslim scientist, then how do we understand the human? Human being is a composite of the body and the soul. Humans possess both primary qualities, such as physical quantities, but also secondary qualities, qualia. And the primary qualities explain the physical functioning of the brain and the body, and the secondary qualities explain consciousness and the God-given gift of the full potential of the human self, which we can only affirm if we accept the existence of secondary properties. So here's a quick review of the concepts that we covered in this short talk. We talked about the Islamic belief of human nature. We talked about the neuroscientific hypothesis on human nature and the dominant hypothesis, which is one of physicalism. We talked about how physicalism is in conflict with the Islamic view of the human being. And then we talked about how many scientists and philosophers are realizing that physicalism is insufficient to explain the totality of the human experience and as an ontology of the world. And with a revised scientific hypothesis, a more holistic view of science, we can reconcile the Islamic view of human nature with the scientific view of human nature. Thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum.